welcome to Practical Cynicism. My name is Eric DeMott, and on today's episode, we're going to talk about some words. As I mentioned previously, I went to college to study what is called classical language, Greek and Latin. The degree path also required some coursework in French and German, since a large body of scholarship is written in those languages. At the end of my studies, I could barely think straight. When my brain reached for a word in English, it would find the French or the Latin. I had dreams in Greek. My life was an ocean of languages and words and dictionaries, and to be honest, I loved it. I spent hours translating and reading, learning new words and ideas, interpreting speeches and comedies and obscure grammar rules. It all started for me when I took my first ancient Greek language course, and I was immediately hooked. Greek has this incredible grammar that is both complex and intuitive and musical. After grasping a handful of root words, the power of language really comes to fruition. One of these root words is logos, which in Greek means word and reason, and comes down to us now as the suffix on all of our ologies: biology, psychology, paleontology, etc. The ology comes from logos, and logos forms the backbone of one of the New Testament's most famous and powerful lines, John 1:1, en arche hen ho logos. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos. Exploring the uses and history of the Logos would fill a very big book, but I bring it up briefly to explore another important root word, philos. Philos means love, and is where we get words like philosophy and philanthropy, the love of wisdom and the love of humans, respectively. Classicists that studied ancient Greek and Latin like I did were once called philologists, lovers of words. Over the last 2 episodes, I shared a cynic story about mugs and some stories about oracles and their maxims, and you may be wondering when I'll ever get to the meat and potatoes of cynicism and share the rules and regulations for how to properly be a cynic. But the cynics lived on the outskirts of town and the outskirts of proper philosophical circles. Unlike the Platonists at the Academy or the Stoics in the Stoa, the cynics did not have a formal school or system of education. They lived and taught their neighbors by shouting at them, demanding food in return for these lessons, and relishing their free time, free from work and worry like a king or a god would. They didn't much care for rules or structure, and so they didn't leave us very much in the way of a cynic creed or catechism or handbook. But of the text we do have, it is easy to pick up on some topics and ideas that will be helpful in outlining a cynic viewpoint. It is as a philologist and philosopher that I bring to you the cynic words of the day. Firstly, the word cynic itself is very interesting and serves as a great starting point. It comes from the Greek word for dog, kuon or kuna, K-U-N in Greek, and Latinized as C-Y-N for cynic. There may be various reasons why this philosophy was associated with dogs. Antisthenes was a proto-cynic and friend of Socrates. He is even featured in Plato's Symposium, where he gives a speech on how wealthy he is despite having very little. It is said that his mother was Thracian, as in not Athenian, and because of this, he wouldn't have been fully accepted by Athenians, especially the aristocrats. He wouldn't have access to all the gymnasia that aristocrats used, but he would have been welcomed at a gym called the Cynosarges, which means the swift dog. A less nuanced version is that cynics, like Diogenes, lived in the streets, barking at their neighbors, begging for food, and generally acting like dogs. To which Diogenes would reply, "Other dogs bite their enemies, but I bite my friends, so as to save them." And by this, he unifies the positive and negative in the name. Yes, it's an insult to be called a dog, but dogs are also faithful companions and protectors and guards. The word cynic has been used ever since, and perhaps unfortunately to a much greater degree than stoic. In our modern times, a cynic isn't someone who has given up their worldly possessions and reputation to pursue virtue. Instead, it has become a label for those who are disenchanted with a world that has normalized commercial and political corruption and have resigned themselves to a mere participation because they feel they cannot change the culture. In the ancient world, few could bear the life of a cynic, but today it's hard to swing a dog without hitting one. Our next word is tufos, which means smoke or fog. Metaphorically, this comes to mean the smoke that is blinding us to truth, wisdom, and virtue, which is to say our false values, things like fame, reputation, our arrogance, ego, and vanity. For the cynic, tufos is the enemy, and the goal is to become atufos, unclouded. And this is obtained firstly by standing outside of all cultural, socio-economic, political spheres and striving to live a simple, ascetic life according to nature. Ascetic, I hear you asking? Is that another fancy Greek SAT word? Well, yes, it is, and an important one for the Cynics. To call back to our note about the gymnasium, the Greek word askesis means exercise or training. Today, ascetic is kind of an old-timey word that describes the lives of medieval monks who have taken their oaths of poverty and chastity and spend their days praying and worshiping God. But in ancient Greek times, it referred to the kind of training an athlete or a student would do. The Cynics considered their lives to be a form of training. Their poverty and shameless behavior were exercises meant to build their endurance and fortitude against the whims of cruel fate. These exercises they called ponoi, from the Greek ponos, which means work, hardship, and toil. As mentioned, shamelessness is one such form of exercise that a Cynic would use to free himself from the smoke. Anadeia is shamelessness in Greek. I know I've hinted at this before by very casually mentioning that Diogenes would masturbate or defecate in public and pursue all other forms of bald-faced indecency, and the common confusion is that the Cynics are recommending this behavior, or even worse, that I'm recommending it. In his own way, Diogenes was a teacher, and the lesson in many of these examples is that these actions are perfectly natural things all animals do. They eat where they are hungry, they sleep where they are tired, etc. And that somehow, of all the animals on the planet, only humans have devised rules and purity codes and cultural norms that make these things seem unseemly. The point is not that these things should be normal, but that they are normal, and it's abnormal that our culture has trained us to see them in any sort of way. Where the Stoic says we must disconnect our feelings from events, the Cynic wants us to examine how we were cultured by our families, peers, and society to have the feelings we have. This is the smoke we must clear out in order to see clearly. By this Cynic training, we aim toward apatheia, or indifference. This word comes from the Greek pathos, which means both suffering and experience, and is where we get words like apathy and apathetic. Today, these words have negatives, sometimes medical connotations related to mental health issues. But to the ancient Greeks, Stoics, and Cynics alike, apatheia is the state of being undisturbed by the adiaphora, the things that we ought to be indifferent to, or rather, the sage would be indifferent to. In our lives, we will suffer from all that life can throw at us: exile, shipwreck, death, sickness, slander, hunger, and combinations thereof. The Cynic chooses to embrace these hardships voluntarily, build a tolerance to these cruelties in order to become indifferent to them. With the words we have discussed, atouphos, anadeia, apatheia, and adiaphora, I know you're thinking to yourself, gee, this Eric guy opened the dictionary and didn't even try to turn the first page. And you're not wrong in that assessment, but one of the best parts about the ancient Greek language is that they put all their best words up front. You see, all these words start with the Greek letter alpha, which is called an alpha privative in this case. When the alpha privative comes before a root word, like touphos in atouphos, it negates the meaning, like the un in undo or the in indifferent. Which brings me to the biggest, most importantest, and lastest word of the day, apophatic. Apophatic is a word that comes from theology, which is the study of God or the divine, from the Greek theos, meaning God. Apophatic means to deny, and thus apophatic theology is a way of thinking about God by saying what God isn't, i.e., God is unknowable, unlimited, etc. This is opposed to cataphatic, describing God by what God is. The letter alpha in Greek is also the first letter of the alphabet, and omega is the last. So in Revelation, when God says, I am the alpha and the omega, he means he is the beginning and the end. He is everything. And saying that something is perfectly fine, but it's not the only way to describe a thing, as we've seen. I bring this up because in similar fashion to God, we would use these words to describe a philosophical sage, a wise man, or perhaps ourselves. The Cynic sage is indifferent, shameless, unclouded by ignorance, and apathetic to fortune's whims. Our being, our virtue, our lives are just as much defined by what they are as by what they aren't, by what we do as much as what we don't do. As we approach the omega of this year and the alpha of the next, many of us will try to make goals and resolutions for the new year. Normally, these take the form of things we want to do: read more books, exercise more, and a personal favorite of mine, learn a new language. These are cataphatic goals. But I implore you, this new year, to also make some resolutions for what you don't want to do, for who you don't want to be. Apophatic resolutions. What aren't you going to do? Who aren't you going to be? Thank you for your time and attention today. As always, speaking to you is an honor, and I hope that all of my words, Greek or otherwise, have given you a new perspective and direction today and tomorrow.